Under the arches of the palazzo in Palermo, there was a smell of iron, oil, and leather. On long tables stood glass flasks, surgical instruments, maps of the starry sky, and models of human organs brought from Salerno. All this was part of the laboratory of Emperor Frederick II Hohenstaufen, a ruler who loved to observe, measure, and record. But it was precisely this interest, intertwined with the fear and envy of others, that gave rise to a rumor that has survived the centuries: that virginity tests were conducted at court, ostensibly for the sake of science, but in reality for the sake of humiliation. Thus began one of the most enduring legends of the Mediterranean in the 13th century. Friends, I welcome you. This is a chronicle that is not usually read by daylight, and you are on a channel where we talk about how power rewrote the human body. Write in the comments where you are watching from: Italy, Germany, Ukraine. Or maybe some of you have been to Sicily and seen the ruins of that very palazzo. It would be interesting to know. Make yourselves comfortable and enjoy the listen. When, at the end of the 13th century, papal legates described the emperor as a man who plays with the laws of the body and faith, they were already working with a preconceived image. By that time, Frederick II was not just a sovereign, but a myth, the Antichrist of the Apocalypse, as the chroniclers at the Curia wrote. He was credited with alchemy, heresy, magic, and, most notably, virginity tests. But the document referred to by later moralists never existed. There is no order, no regulations, no decree on conducting such tests. Instead, there are letters, diplomatic notes, and chronicles written after the emperor's death, when it was safe to accuse the dead. The first mention of the tests is found in the writings of Matthew Paris, a monk who never left England. He wrote from the words of eyewitnesses, whom he did not name, that Frederick conducted experiments comparing purity and corruption for the sake of knowledge of nature. This text has been quoted hundreds of times, although no official from the Sicilian Chancellery archives has confirmed it. Moreover, the court's expense register, preserved from the 13th century, records payments to doctors and scientists exclusively for medical observations, anatomical notes, and veterinary practices, not for participation in experiments on humans. But the rumor lived on. It was fueled by envy of the court, where Latin and Arabic were spoken together, where Jews were appointed court physicians, and women from noble families were taught astronomy and botany. For the clergy of that time, such freedom seemed threatening in itself. It was much easier to explain it away as debauchery under the guise of science. Thus, a simple laboratory was turned into a sinful chamber, and a medical treatise into instructions for seduction. The papal chancellery knew how images worked. In sermons in the mid-13th century, Frederick was called a researcher of the flesh, and although this referred to his philosophical works on the animal nature of man, the crowd understood it literally. The anti-imperial poem Contra Staufensis features a scene of examinations, a literary allegory, but chroniclers quoted it as fact. Thus was born the legend in which the scholar and sovereign became a monster who tested the bodies of his subjects. Documents from the Salerno Medical School tell a completely different story. Where papal sources saw a sinful experiment, there were actually debates about the structure of the body and the nature of infertility. Doctors observed sick women, with their consent, for therapeutic purposes, and compiled tables of symptoms. For an era when illness was considered a punishment, this was almost a rebellion. But even this rebellion was attributed to the emperor. In the 13th century, there was no single view on what research was acceptable. Some pointed to the Hippocratic Oath, others to the ban on autopsies imposed by the Church. Frederick II, patron of the Salerno School, allowed his doctors to study the anatomy of deceased prisoners, which, in itself, caused shock. This fact became the basis for speculation. If anatomical experiments are allowed, opponents argued, then something else is also possible: examinations of the living. No document confirmed this, but in political struggle, a hint is enough. Diplomatic correspondence between Pope Gregory IX and the French court played a special role. In one of the letters, the papal legate calls Frederick a tester of chastity, referring to his free thinking and discussion of marriage laws. However, later commentators took the phrase literally. When, a century later, chroniclers collected the sins of the past, this hint became evidence. The statutes of the Sicilian court, preserved in a 14th century copy, state, "Women of the court are not subject to physical examination without consent and without a doctor from among the scholars of Salerno." This line, intended to protect maids and courtiers from arbitrariness, would be interpreted centuries later in the opposite way, as permission for examination. Thus, a document created for the good became part of the myth of the monster emperor. Meanwhile, two images of Frederick coexisted in the chronicles. For Eastern scholars, he was the patron of reason, while for Latin chroniclers, he was the prince of doubt. He abolished torture in the territories of the Kingdom of Sicily and demanded written evidence instead of confessions obtained under pressure. But it was precisely this rationalism that provoked the fury of the clergy. When the authorities cease to believe in miracles, they are accused of heresy. Gradually, the legend of the tests became a tool of moralistic propaganda. Travelers and monks retold it as a terrifying parable about punishment for pride. None of them had seen the imperial laboratories, but almost all of them quoted the same words, from texts that appeared decades after Frederick's death. Thus began a myth in which fear of knowledge was intertwined with the struggle for power. And the more documents confirmed the emperor's innocence, the more eagerly people clung to the rumors. After all, paper is silent, but rumors live on. In the chancelleries of Europe, there was no longer any dispute that Frederick II was dangerous not only with weapons, but also with his mind. His letters to Arab scholars and his correspondence with alchemists looked, in the opinion of the Curia, like a challenge to the very structure of the world. In one of his bulls, Pope Gregory IX wrote directly that the emperor experiments with the mysteries of creation without fear of the Creator. To the public, these words sounded like a verdict. In southern Italy and the German lands, leaflets with engravings were distributed, depicting Frederick, among women in white clothes holding mirrors and vessels, an allegory of experimenting with chastity. Later, historians determined that the scene was borrowed from ancient miniatures about the goddess Diana, but at the time, no one checked. It was at this moment that the phrase, "science for the sake of debauchery," was born, which would go on to appear in chronicles. It was repeated without anyone noticing that it first appeared in a sermon by a Dominican friar serving at the French court 15 years after the emperor's death. The sermon was called "On Curiosity Without Faith," and called for lay people to be denied access to medical treatises so that they would not fall into the temptation of knowledge. In it, Frederick II appeared only as an example, a man who allowed himself to speculate about the nature of conception without quoting scripture. But the image that remained in the minds of the crowd was that of a ruler conducting experiments on women. When copies of his court decrees were found in Naples, it turned out that most of them concerned the distribution of taxes and medical payments. There is also a rare clause, permission for doctors to observe pregnant women in the presence of older relatives and at their request. The papal side called this legalizing sin, but modern historians see it as the first case of formalized medical observation. This is not an experiment, but an attempt at statistics. But in the 13th century, statistics did not yet have a language, only fear and rumor. The emperor knew the value of rumors. Texts translated from Arabic on crowd psychology circulated among his entourage. How news spreads, how fear works. Perhaps this is why Frederick left the slander unanswered. In none of his letters does he refute the accusations. For his enemies, this became proof of guilt. For posterity, it became a mystery. But if we look at the treasury books, it becomes clear that after the first pamphlets, payments to astrologers and natural philosophers were sharply reduced, and instead, expenses for lawyers and diplomatic gifts appeared. The emperor understood that it was impossible to fight for the truth in this game. A piece of paper with the seal of the Curia was enough to destroy any reputation. One of the later chronicle collections of the 14th century states that some court women disappeared without a trace. This added fuel to the fire. But lists of those who died or were dismissed from service, found in the archives of Palermo, show that most of these women married or moved to northern Italy with dowries provided by the court itself. Normal personnel turnover was turned into a story about victims. Thus, rumor became more frightening than truth. The legend spread particularly actively in monastery schools. There, where young novices were taught virtue, Frederick's chronicles were cited as an example of the downfall of the proud. Monastic correspondence contains expressions such as, "He practiced like a doctor, but lived like a devil." For them, it was not an investigation but a parable that replaced reality. But there were other voices, scholars from Bologna, where manuscripts from all over the Mediterranean converged, tried to reconstruct the real picture. In one of the lists of acts of the royal chancellery, they found a mention of Frederick's visit to Salerno, where he observed medical classes. Women were indeed present there, students, heirs to ancient traditions. They had the right to listen to lectures and take notes. This fact alone was sensational. In a society where the female body was considered a source of temptation, the right to knowledge became an act of audacity. It is not surprising that a decade later, this episode was distorted beyond recognition. For the Curia, however, every step the emperor took was a threat. He spoke of the equality of languages, of the need to teach Arabic medicine, and recognized astrology as part of nature. In Rome, this sounded like heresy. Therefore, he was credited with everything that caused alarm: necromancy, debauchery, experiments with the soul. The chastity tests fit perfectly into the scheme. They frightened, humiliated, and aroused disgust and curiosity at the same time. When, after his death, they did not dare to bury Frederick's body in daylight, the priests read prayers in whispers. By that time, the legend had already taken on a life of its own, separate from his name. It was copied, inserted into the chronicles of new centuries, supplemented with details that never existed: mirrors, scales, priestesses of science. Thus the document died, and the myth took on flesh. Several centuries later, fragments of these texts were found in universities in Germany and Italy, and quoted in works on the moral decline of rulers. Few bothered to check where the quote came from. It passed from collection to collection, from sermon to lecture. Sometimes they wrote next to it, source, an anonymous chronicle. And no one was bothered by this. The story of the exams became an example of how lies become established by the seal of approval. All a monk had to do was rewrite someone else's rumor, add a date, and attribute it to a secretary, and the myth became a document. Paper, created for the truth, once again served deception. Meanwhile, in Sicily itself, traces of this fear remained for another century. Strange articles appeared in the city statutes of the late Middle Ages: a ban on examining women for the sake of science, and a requirement for relatives to be present during medical procedures. No one remembered where these clauses came from. They were written just in case. Thus, a phantom story gave rise to real laws. The further back in time we go, the clearer it becomes. The accusation of experimentation was not about morality, but about power. Whoever controls the body controls the conscience. For the papal curia, it was a convenient symbol. For scientists, it was a curse that cut Europe off from Eastern medicine for 2 centuries. When reading the letters of Frederick II's contemporaries, a strange detail catches the eye. Almost everyone speaks of him in terms of fear, not facts. A Florentine notary wrote that this emperor made people think that reason is above the fear of God. and therein lay the main sin of his era. He abolished dogma, where obedience was expected of him. He demanded proof. And so his every action was interpreted as a challenge. Even his order to establish the first veterinary school in Naples was attributed to curiosity about the flesh. The archives contain an order for the supply of glass and silver for workshops, probably for the very laboratories where he was accused of sinful experiments. But the list of expenses tells a different story. Retorts, mortars, instruments for distillation and storage of medicines. All this was needed for research into poisons and antidotes. However, later moralists interpreted the very fact of purchasing glass as evidence of secret observations of the body. Thus, an item devoid of sin became a symbol of debauchery. 20th century historians studying the papal archives discovered that the phrase tested virginity appeared in only one document, a Latin chronicle written 60 years after the emperor's death. The author was a Dominican living in Avignon who had never visited Sicily. He used the expression experimenta pudicitiae, literally experiments of chastity. In the context of the text, it referred to philosophical reflections on the nature of morality, but a century later, copyists understood the expression literally. Translators into vulgar Italian gave the word experiments a physical meaning, and the story took hold. It should not be forgotten that in Frederick's era, the body was subject to jurisdiction. The Church viewed the flesh as evidence of sin or innocence. Blood, scars, birthmarks, anything could be used as evidence. Tests involving water, hot iron, or fasting were legal practices. Against this backdrop, virginity tests did not seem implausible. People believed that the invisible could be measured. Therefore, the legend took root, not because people believed in it blindly, but because it seemed logical in the logic of that era. In fact, the emperor's office books describe completely different examinations. Checking soldiers after battles, medical examinations before wedding contracts, procedures for female slaves bought from merchants. All of this was of an economic, not mystical nature. Frederick tried to regulate markets where the human body was a commodity, a poor defense against myth, too cold for legend. The papal side, on the contrary, used the image of sin as a political weapon. In 1337, Gregory IX excommunicated the emperor, and a clause about carnal experiments and indecent entertainment was included in the text of the bull. Even then, lawyers noted that this clause was not based on any judicial act. But, for the public, there was no difference between what was proven and what was written with a seal. Frederick responded in his own way. He established a commission on moral affairs, which included lawyers, astrologers, and doctors. The commission's task was to collect the laws of different peoples on marriage, inheritance, and corporal punishment. This project formed the basis of the famous Sicilian constitutions, the first systematic collection of laws in Europe after Roman law. In it, the body ceased to be an object of repentance and became an object of judgment. It was this step that finally convinced the Curia that they were dealing not just with a ruler, but with a heretic. After Frederick's death, the myth became a convenient excuse for repression against his descendants. His son, Conrad, was accused of inherited depravity. Blood as proof of guilt is the oldest trick in the book. And in the sermons of the 14th century, we can see how a single phrase about experiments in chastity gave rise to an entire dynastic curse. Thus, a symbol is transformed into a hereditary stigma. It is curious that the earliest depictions of experiments appeared not in Italy, but in France. In one of the psalters now kept in Paris, a man in a crown is depicted, surrounded by women with vessels. In the margins is written, Rex Siciliae et filiae peccati, King of Sicily and daughters of sin. The artist had obviously never seen the emperor. The crown is painted in the French style, and the clothing resembles the robes of St. Louis. The image went viral before the advent of printing. Copyists reproduced the drawing without understanding who it depicted. Thus, the visual memory of Europe perpetuated a lie. In 15th century university debates, Frederick's name became an example of scholarly error. Professors of morality cited him as a warning. Knowledge without faith leads to depravity. When humanists tried to justify him as an enlightened monarch, they were accused of heresy. Fear of the body remained stronger than fact. The most bitter thing is that all this became fixed in historical memory, as if the myth had once taken the form of a protocol. Today, museums display cases labeled medical instruments of Frederick II, but most of these items are later copies from the Renaissance, donated by collectors. The real instruments disappeared long ago. All that remains is paper, where fact and fiction are indistinguishable. And yet, if we put aside the propaganda, a feeling of unease remains. It is unease about the moment when knowledge first challenged dogma, when man dared to call the body not a sin, but a part of the world. And the world responded with accusations of sin. This is the grim essence of the story of the exams. It tells not of debauchery, but of panic in the face of rationality. Century after century, the legend of Frederick II crystallized into an educational cliché, the emperor who devoted himself to carnal science. It was repeated by monastery historians, poets, and even lawyers. By the middle of the 16th century, when Europe was already familiar with anatomical theaters and public autopsies, his name continued to be associated with experiments on women. Thus, the past took revenge on knowledge. Each new step in medicine seemed to confirm the accusation made against the one who had taken it before anyone else. When the anatomist Vesalius first openly lectured on the human body, his listeners recalled the emperor who tried to measure chastity. Even in the Renaissance, the shadow of the 13th century remained alive. The treatises of Catholic theologians contained phrases such as, "The mortification of the flesh is the path to truth, not its study." Resistance to experimentation became a moral virtue, and Frederick appeared in these texts not as a man, but as a warning. When 19th century archivists began publishing actual documents from his court, they were struck by their rationality. Instead of mysticism and debauchery, there were tax tables, statutes on doctors, records on veterinary schools, and the organization of baths and sanitary commissions. One report describes how the emperor allocated funds to clean the sewers of Palermo in order to reduce mortality from fever. But, for many historians, this sounded no less heretical than the old myth. A sovereign who cared about sanitation seemed too modern for the Middle Ages. It was easier to believe in a devilish experimenter than to recognize a rationalist among kings. Meanwhile, the legend of the virginity tests entered the realm of art. In German chronicles of the Reformation, it already sounded like a symbol of Rome's corruption. Catholic writers accused Protestants of Frederick's legacy, while Protestants, on the contrary, accused them of papal depravity, which began with his blasphemy. Each side used the old myth as a mirror for the other's guilt. Its content was secondary. What mattered was that it worked as a universal horror. If we look at the surviving documents of the 13th century, we can see how the era itself feared the subject of the body. Frederick's royal statutes stipulate that a doctor has no right to touch a sick woman without the presence of relatives, but is obliged to record the symptoms in writing. For the first time in Europe, medicine required reporting. However, these lines, an attempt at protection, were later turned into evidence of guilt. Every norm that restricted violence became a reason to suspect violence. Thus, society punished those who tried to put science above superstition. One of the later Italian chronicles states that after the emperor's death, his body did not decay, a sign of evil forces. Today, historians suggest that this was the result of embalming. Sicilian doctors were skilled in the technique of treating bodies with resins and herbs. But medieval rumor saw this as a curse. Death did not destroy the myth. It only reinforced it. In German lands, there was a different version, that Frederick did not die, but was hidden in a mountain, where he awaited the end of time as the Antichrist. There he continued his experiments, and when the world plunged back into sin, he would come out and bring judgment. This was no longer history, but revelation. The man who tried to measure nature was turned into a mythical shadow, punishing curiosity. At the end of the 19th century, Italian scholars published the Codex Diplomaticus Regni Siciliae, a collection of authentic documents from his court. There is not a single mention of tests, chastity experiments, or virginity exams. On the contrary, there are orders on the protection of widows, the rights of female heirs, and penalties for violence. But even these documents did not rid the emperor's name of suspicion. Popular publications continued to repeat the phrase, "He tested women out of curiosity." The story took root not in the archives, but in the imagination. For 20th century researchers, this legend became an example of how political slander works. Historians compared it to pamphlets against Catherine de' Medici, Marie Antoinette, or later rumors about the scientific debauchery of revolutionary societies. The pattern is the same everywhere. A woman or ruler engaged in science is equated with sin, rationality with lust, research with insulting faith. And in this context, Frederick II was the first in a long line of those condemned for knowledge. The archival trace of the myth can also be found in the lexicon. To this day, the Italian expression fare l'esperimento di pudicizia is used ironically to refer to a useless test. It originated from that very phrase in the Chronicles, but its meaning has long since faded. The language has retained the scar, even after the body of history has healed. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, archaeologists have found the remains of his laboratories, rooms where alchemical and medical experiments were conducted. Inside are vessels with mineral residues, clay pipes, scales, and charred records of formulas. There is no trace of examinations or violence, only traces of science ahead of its time. These findings did not cause a sensation. The newspapers mentioned them briefly. Confirms Friedrich's rationalism. Too peaceful a conclusion for a century that loves monsters. And yet, in museum display cases next to his name, the words "debates about chastity" still flash by. Not because it is true, but because the myth has become part of the cultural landscape. It cannot be destroyed. It can only be dismantled, layer by layer, like archaeologists dismantle soil. Under the layer of lies is a layer of fear. Under fear is envy. Under envy is an attempt to understand. This perhaps is the real drama. Humanity always confuses research with intrusion. The emperor who asked questions about nature was accused of offending morality. His laboratory became an allegory of human horror at his own body. Today, when the name of Frederick II comes up in university courses, it is most often accompanied by the words, "anatomy of power." His figure has become a metaphor for the conflict between knowledge and dogma. But behind this metaphor, there is still the body, the very one around which the legend was born. Documents found in the archives of the Vatican, Palermo, and Messina show how, step by step, lies became the truth of bureaucracy. A single hint inserted into the ambassador's report was enough for it to become a fact in a textbook a generation later. Historians at the end of the 20th century tried to trace the entire path of the rumor. The investigation began with an embassy report from 1239, in which one of the papal legates wrote that the emperor forces his doctors to investigate secrets that are not proper to know. This is the only phrase that can be interpreted as the source of the legend. It is not known what exactly the ambassador meant. Perhaps he was referring to the dissection of animals or anatomical lectures. But in the chronicles of the 15th century, this line already read, "The emperor forced women's bodies to be examined for the sake of knowledge." The mechanism of distortion is simple. Each copyist added his own explanation, and the further away from the event, the more vivid the lie became. At the end of the 20th century, an accounting book was found in the archives of Sicily. listing the expenses for scientists who participated in the project of translating Arabic medical treatises. One of them was On the Causes of Infertility and the Structure of the Uterus. It was a medical work based on ancient and Eastern sources. Its translation apparently gave rise to rumors about female experiments. For the emperor's opponents, there was no difference between studying the text and studying the body. Knowledge concerning the flesh was considered blasphemous in itself. But despite the revelations, the myth lives on today. Lives on. It is convenient, simple, spectacular, emotionally charged. Any legend about abuse of power sounds more convincing than a boring list of pharmacists and taxes. This is the nature of rumor. It appeals not to reason but to fear. And fear of the free mind has proven to be more enduring than documents. Modern reconstructions show that Frederick II created one of the most advanced healthcare systems of his time. Under him, there were health inspectors, pharmacies, schools for surgeons, and notarized forms for medical reports. He introduced penalties for poor quality medicines and false diagnoses. For the 13th century, this seemed almost miraculous. But for the emperor's enemies, the miracle was suspicious. They explained it not as reform but as sin. The papal archives contain instructions to missionaries sent to southern Italy after the emperor's death. It says, "In places where people were corrupted by Frederick's philosophy, shame and fear must be restored." This means that fear was considered a cure for knowledge. It was in this climate that legends about cynical tests were born, moral scarecrows designed to keep society from thinking. By the 19th century, these legends had become part of cultural folklore. French novelists wrote about laboratories of lust, German moralists about devilish anatomy. None of them had read the sources, and when scientists published the authentic records of the Kingdom of Sicily, journalists simply added phrases such as a notorious libertine and scientist. Reality could not defeat the image. There is a museum display case in Bari where a copy of the papal legate's letter of accusation lies under glass. Next to it is an exhibition plaque, Frederick II, Myth and Document. Two halves separated by glass. On one side is the paper, on the other is the distortion. And visitors, looking through the glass, more often than not remain with the myth. It is brighter. But when you look at the original documents, that mythical gravity disappears. Instead of the Antichrist, you see a bureaucrat and thinker, a man who wrote treatises on falconry, the sea, and taxes. He viewed knowledge as part of governance, not temptation. And in this, perhaps, lies his true fault, being too modern too soon. Today, historians call him the first European rationalist. He did not reject God, but demanded that faith should not interfere with the study of the world. He wanted doctors to treat by observation, not by prayer, and courts to be based on evidence, not hearsay. And that is precisely what made him dangerous to his century. The legend of the virginity tests is not about sex science, or sin. It is a story about the fear of transparency, because anyone who makes knowledge visible becomes an enemy of those who live in obscurity. In the 13th century, this fear bore the name of Frederick. In every century, it takes on a new form. The exhibition Made by Pamphlet, which opened in Palermo at the beginning of the 21st century, summed up a century of confusion. Copies of all the chronicles mentioning experiments in chastity were collected in one room. On the walls nearby are photocopies of accounting books and decrees on the protection of women at court. The inscription at the exit is simple: Myth, science for the sake of debauchery. Document, debauchery for power. And as the viewer leaves, they see one last reminder: the silhouette of the emperor against a backdrop of translucent pages, where lines from ancient bulls are mixed with medical treatises. No justification, no verdict, just history's quiet question: which is worse, knowledge without shame, or power without memory?